Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, that isn't.
Use this term.
Well,
that's why we moved here. That's why we got out. The college to various friends, you know, and renamed it.
well, I don't know.
Which was quite rural at the time. Scriptures we have divided out.
You've made the point a long time ago. And you know, the whole business of but if they go and see her can only but I would even say, I think the new guy
on the holy ground.
Well, yeah, I start out with bread.
Good afternoon. My name is Denis, Kaiser, and I'm an assistant professor of church history from Amherst University. I'm chairing this afternoon session.
Denis?
Yeah.
Just a brief announcement. This session is going to be streamed online. The plans to do that this morning unfortunately didn't quite work out, but this afternoon and tomorrow will all be streamed live. So if you were going to say scandalous things, you might want to think twice before you
Go home, Grable. Yeah, I better.
So the session this afternoon is called Adventism and Wider Society in the Middle and Late 19th Century. We'll have four, I think, very fine presentations. And the way how we'll do it is basically that I will introduce each speaker before the presentation, and then after the four presentations, we will have time for questions. So there won't be questions after the presentations, or after each presentation, but after we are done with everybody.
Denis, sorry, those of you who want to share it with your friends on social media, it's being streamed from the GC Archives YouTube channel. Is that right?
I'm about to, once I find the link, I'm going to share.
Yeah. So that's if you want people you know, or people said, "Gosh, I wish I could be there," then that's the place. Sorry, Denis.
Could you repeat that? Repeat it. Where do you find it?
It's the GC Archives YouTube channel.
Thank you, sir.
So the first presentation will be by Dr. Brian Strayer, who is Professor Emeritus of History at Amherst University. He retired from active teaching in July 2016 after nearly 42 years in education. During his career, he taught students ranging from 7th grade to doctoral level. He was on my dissertation committee last year, as well as Dr. David Holland. Dr. Strayer's professional specialties included courses in early modern European history, Seventh-day Adventist history, women's history, and special methods of teaching history. To date, he has written 4 books in French history. I won't name the topics for sake of time. He's also the author of 4 books on Adventist history, most notably 3 biographies, one on John Loughborough, one on John Byington, and the pianist composer Dr. Blythe Owen. In addition, Dr. Strayer has published scores of articles, book reviews, book chapters in French, Canadian, and American scholarly journals, magazines, and books, and has presented more than 30 scholarly papers at professional conferences, and has written dozens of articles for Adventist print and online encyclopedias. I guess today we will have one more presentation. He's a member of several international scholars organizations, such as Phi Alpha Theta, Alpha Mu or Gamma, and Phi Kappa Phi. The presentation this afternoon is called Seeing Themselves as Others Saw Them, Battle Creek Adventists in the Public Eye between 1855 and 1890. So give the hand to Dr. Sprague.
Well, after dinner, you know, you want something a little on the light side, and I do promise you some humor and some satire this afternoon. This paper will examine the public's changing and often conflicting views of Adventists from 1855 to 1890, especially as reflected in the local newspapers of Battle Creek. When Adventists arrived in Battle Creek in the 1850s, many citizens held negative views toward them, largely because of 5 practices. First, they settled in the west end of town and kept largely to themselves. Second, they adopted a vegetarian lifestyle. Third, they observed the 7th day as their Sabbath. Fourth, they taught a rather bleak end-time millennial message. Fifth, they preached and practiced a legalistic doctrine and lifestyle. Among the local citizens of Battle Creek, Adventist vegetarian habits quickly earned them the nickname of gizzardites, meaning health reform nuts, because they were fussy about what they put in their gizzards or stomachs. Because they built their meeting houses, schools, printing press, and sanitarium all on the west end of town, local citizens also called them Canaanites, who refused to mix with the Philistines, the non-Adventists. However, there were 2 gizzardites who violated this unwritten code of isolation. On warm summer nights, James and Ellen White left Canaan in their horse-drawn spring wagon pulled by Charlie and ventured into the Philistine side of town. There, equipped with Bibles and a kerosene lamp, they boldly preached wherever a few listeners gathered. And that source is Rust's Business Directory, not an Adventist source at all. Thanks largely to their holy boldness, Adventists soon began to thrive like Jonah's gourd, as Anson Van Buren, an early settler, put it. In less than 2 decades, Adventists would surpass all the other religious groups in Battle Creek. In part due to the influx of Adventists after 1855, the town quadrupled in size to over 4,000 citizens by 1860. The growth of Adventist institutions served as a magnet to attract hundreds of believers to Battle Creek in the 1860s. Further organization of the Adventist Publishing Association, 1860, the Michigan Conference, 1861, the General Conference, 1863, and the Western Health Reform Institute, 1866, drew additional Adventist employees and their families to Battle Creek. Also during the 1860s, Adventists in growing numbers left Canaan to venture forth into business enterprises among the Philistines in downtown Battle Creek. Of the 2 bakeries in town, Adventist J.M. Aldrich operated one at 24 West Main Street, directly across from City Hall. Of the 3 architects in the area, Adventist William K. Loughborough, the brother of John Norton Loughborough, had established his office at 77 Champion Street. The only broom maker in the city was Adventist Joseph P. Kellogg, the father of John Harvey Kellogg, as well as 15 other children. Ellen White's son Edson operated one of 2 music supply stores. In addition, many Adventists sang in Professor Marshall Cobb's Choral Union, which gave annual concerts with organ accompaniment by Adventist or Edwin Barnes. Moreover, Adventists operated the Health Reform Institute, the only sanitarium in Calhoun County. Finally, of the 5 newspapers published in Battle Creek in the 1860s, Adventists produced 3 of them. Review, the Youth Instructor, and the Health Reformer. Despite its small size, by mid-century, Battle Creek had seen no fewer than 22 newspapers roll off its presses. Walter W. Woolnough started several papers between 1845 and his death in 1904, including The Moon, which appeared in daily, nightly, and weekly editions. As we shall see, The Moon rarely treated Adventists kindly, especially after 1869, when Martin E. Brown became editor and introduced a new kind of journalism. Brown favored what he called a more cozy manner of writing. He knew how to squeeze the juiciest bits from a local scandal. Often his subtleties were as direct hits as a hammer on a nail. One local citizen declared that reading the Nightly Moon was more fun than a box of monkeys. Its satirical style made it a huge success throughout the city. Brown fed the changing tastes of his subscribers, who by the 1870s were more secular and who viewed religious sects, at least some of them, with a jaundiced eye. By 1870, Battle Creek boasted 5,800 inhabitants. Its 73 merchants did more than $1 million worth of business every year. On the edge of the city, the exclusive Gagoak Boat Club staged regattas and sculling competitions. Locals including Adventists, enjoyed swimming, boating, picnics, camping, and entertaining lecturers. To most citizens, these developments represented progress and modernization. For many of Battle Creek's Adventists, on the other hand, the growing crime rate, the worldliness, and the decline of simple rural values were signs that the end of the world was near. For example, in 1857, half of the city's residents owned cows. By 1870, there were only 64 bovines left in Battle Creek, most of them owned by Adventists like the Byingtons and the Amadons. Yet increasingly during the 1870s, many Adventists involved themselves in the city's cultural life. Among these were hundreds of young employees at the Review and Herald Press and Sanitarium, some of whom, the record shows, sneaked off to the Red Onion for a steak, slaked their illicit thirst for alcohol at a local saloon, or joined one of the college's baseball teams that played city competitors. Other Adventists, like the Amadons, with more refined tastes, attended meetings of the Christian Philosophical Society and the Literary Society. They also participated in the city's singing school and took their kids to see Fanfo's Caravan, Lent's Circus, and the Cardiff Giant Hoax when they all came to town. On warm spring and summer days, still others took their families fishing, swimming, boating, picnicking, or snake hunting at Gagoak Lake. The social gadabout, Martha Amadon, often planned elaborate picnics at the lake for dozens of her friends, up to 50 at one time. As more of the Gizzardites left Canaan to mingle with Battle Creek's Philistines in their social and cultural activities, the city's newspapers began paying increased attention to them. In 1872, the Battle Creek Journal praised Adventists for their elegant printing and publishing house. A certain H.W., who routinely criticized most churches, primarily for their failure to oppose the march of intemperance across our country, praised Adventists for their opposition to alcohol and tobacco. He described them as far ahead of most, if not all, the other sects. Well, he cared not a fig about what they believed as to the Bible or the visions of their leaders. he valued their honesty and strong advocacy of temperance. He concluded by asserting, Adventists stand foremost in the scale of real, good citizenship, and the example set by them in dress, sobriety, industry, economy, and thrift is worthy of the highest praise. A year later, 1879, a certain Jack Tobias, praising Adventists for their college, publishing house, sanitarium, and the new dime tabernacle, called them a courageous class of men who are just as anxious to improve this our city as the rest of the folks, even if they do believe the world is coming to an end. Although the newspapers consistently printed positive reports about Uriah Smith for his many useful inventions, and about the Byington and Amadon families for their cultural contributions to the city, primarily in the area of music, not all the news fit to print portrayed the church in a positive light. In 1878, the Battle Creek Journal broke the story of a stealing ring at the college and sanitarium operated by college students. Constable George Rogers arrested one student from Kentucky and two others from Nebraska for hoarding stolen goods in their rooms. After the three had been jailed, the thievery stopped. Citizens were further scandalized to read in the Michigan Tribune that an Adventist preacher named Myron Butler had recently been arrested in Flint and charged with rape. Further investigation carried on by Uriah Smith, however, forced the paper to issue a retraction and to clarify that Myron Butler is not a Seventh-day Adventist, but belongs to another denomination. 6 months later, the Tribune reported that an Adventist named Freeman had murdered his daughter in Pocasset, Massachusetts. Another Adventist, the Reverend Huawout, had seduced a woman in Gifford, Iowa, causing her lover to commit suicide. Once again, Uriah Smith forced the Tribune to clarify that both Freeman and Huawout belonged to another denomination of Adventists, not the Seventh-day variety, probably Church of God. Although Adventists still constituted a majority of the population, by the mid-1870s they were making their voices heard in the city's political circles. In May of 1874, George Amadon and J.W. Batchelor, both Review employees, signed a petition requesting that sections of Park Street and other streets adjacent to the Michigan Central Railroad and City Park be leveled with gravel. 5 years later, in 1879, several Adventist men signed yet another petition, this time demanding the resignation or recall of two Board of Education trustees whose recent decisions they saw as detrimental to the interests of the public schools and consequently to the public welfare. In yet a third petition, Adventists asked the mayor and common council to send a road crew to fill in the potholes and build boardwalks along Hill Street, north of the sanitarium. That was in the land of Canaan on the west end. During the 1880s, Adventists became increasingly involved in the social, cultural, and political life of the city. Edson White's prestigious West End singing school attracted both Adventists and non-Adventists. In the spring of 1882, the college orchestra and Edson's choir performed at Centennial Hall. The concert included a female quartet singing the popular song, "The Lovely Star." The girls' voices blended so harmoniously that when they finished singing, the audience clapped, whistled, and stomped their feet to show their appreciation. 3 years later, Edson's choir sang at the WCTU convention in the city, accompanied by the talented organist Kate Amadon, the daughter of George and Martha Amadon. Soon Kate began playing the organ not only at the tabernacle, but also for Sunday services at St. Thomas Episcopal Church. Kate was also courting Fred Gage, the son of William C. Gage, lay preacher and printer, who in 1882 and 83 became Battle Creek's first Adventist mayor. As Adventists began playing more prominent roles in the city's life, the local newspapers gave them increased attention. The Daily Journal regularly listed the names of all Adventists who attended the Michigan camp meetings in the 1880s. The Daily Moon reported not only on Christmas programs and concerts at the college, but also enlightened its subscribers as to when our Adventist friends were observing weeks of prayer. At Christmas 1886, for example, a large, full-rigged ship loaded with presents filled the front section of the dime tabernacle, and all who attended enjoyed a highly interesting holiday entertainment. In May of 1887, the Grand Army of the Republic held Memorial Day services in the sanctuary free of charge, thanks to the patriotic generosity of the church members. The Daily Journal regularly praised the denomination for erecting profitable institutions in the city, calling Adventists a most exemplary as well as a most useful and enterprising portion of our community. The editor noted that their ranks included some of our most honored and influential citizens. Overall, he concluded, Adventists have added materially to the growth, prosperity, and wealth of our city. The editor of the Citizen agreed, calling Adventists honorable and respected citizens, who as a group had proved themselves to be thrifty, moral, well-behaved, and an energetic class of citizens who reflect credit upon the community in which they have become domiciled. The Citizen regretted the manner in which other local newspapers had misrepresented Adventists, calling their negative prose malicious attacks and unfounded assertions. Doubtless the editor of the Citizen aimed his barbs at Martin Brown, editor of the Daily, Nightly, and Weekly Moon, all of which majored in scandal and minored in truth by sharing salacious stories about local citizens and groups, particularly religious groups, employing a style of writing which in the 1890s would be called yellow journalism. Brown was just sort of a pioneer in that movement before it became known as yellow journalism. Brown basically refused to allow the facts to get in the way of any juicy rumor that might sell more copies of his papers. Since we're being streamed, I'm thinking of skipping the next paragraph. No, Lisa?
No.
All right, Lisa says go with it.
Stop straining.
In June of 1880, Martin Brown reported that Ambrose C. Spicer, a minister and professor at Battle Creek College, believing he had committed the unpardonable sin, had attempted to commit suicide by stripping naked and trying to drown himself in the Kalamazoo River. Failing at that, he ran onto the railroad tracks, hoping the eastbound freight train would kill him. It took 4 men to subdue him. It is a great story, except there was no one named Ambrose Spicer at Battle Creek College between 1874 and 1881. I checked that out with Mary Jones, our authority on the history of Battle Creek College. The story was printed in 1880. In 1881, Brown informed the public that Adventists do not believe in life insurance because their prophet, Mrs. Ellen G. White, has issued an edict against it in one of her visions, in which she considers it simply a form of gambling. She apparently saw no harm in buying property insurance, however, as the Citizen reported that in 1884, a fire causing $500 damage to the White home would all be covered by insurance. Editor Brown also delighted in exposing hypocrisy among religious groups. In 1883, he accused Adventists in the West End of making an unusual amount of noise on Sundays, since their Gentile neighbors endeavored to keep quiet on Saturdays. Brown did not think it fair for Adventists to make such a racket on Sundays. In 1884, the Nightly Moon accused the son of a prominent Adventist of using chloroform on a girl and sexually assaulting her, alleging that his father, an Adventist minister, was ready to pay $500, which at that time was a year's salary for a minister, to settle the matter. Likewise, in a moonshine column devoted to rumors, both the Daily Moon and the Weekly Moon ridiculed claims by Ellen White, James M. Garner, his teenage daughter Anna Garner, and an Adventist prophet or crank in Chicago that the world would end on either October 22, 1844, or January 5, 1885. Take your pick. I hope so, Brown exclaimed. It would certainly settle several disagreeable questions for us. When an unnamed man in Brooklyn returned $2,300 he had stolen from the city of Battle Creek years before, Brown smirked. Now, let the Adventists set the judgment day. But in July of 1887, when a certain Professor Proctor cited scientific evidence to show that the destruction of the earth was imminent, his revelations, quote, frightened even our Adventist friends, Brown declared, to such a degree that they will not hereafter put up such substantial buildings. In August of 1885, the Daily Moon accused a gang of about 25 Adventists of throwing a dozen eggs at Basil Stefanoff, a Macedonian man whose lectures allegedly proved that Sunday was the New Testament Sabbath. It is a disgrace to every Adventist who participated in the egging that they have no more religious tolerance than that, Brown scolded. Such fanaticism will always have its day and subside, he concluded. The Daily Moon focused special attention on the battle between the two prophets, Ellen White and Anna Garmeyer, in 1885. Brown informed his readers that Mrs. White had denounced Anna and her father, James Garmeyer, as emissaries of the devil. Torn between the two prophets, many Adventists, he reported, had lost their reason. Much gunpowder has been expended by the canons of the church on the Garmeyer movement, the editor opined. General Conference President George I. Butler, who is very bitter when he is bitter, and that's how he tastes most of the time, Brown said, had rebuked both Garmeyers and was allegedly going from house to house, fighting them. The Adventists seemed to forget the scriptural warning that a house divided against itself cannot stand, Brown reprimanded. When Railroad Standard Time was first introduced in 1885, the Daily Moon informed its readers that both Catholics and Adventists had adopted it. Now then, let their shops be run on the same uniform legal time, he suggested, implying, of course, that Adventists should have their shops open on Saturday. During a severe thunderstorm in 1887, when lightning struck the center pole at the Adventist camp meeting tent at Bel Air, Michigan, the editor pointed out that all the saloons and other bad places escaped damage. Brown clucked. That kind of business will not do. Finally, in December of 1887, the Daily Moon reported on the trial of Ralph Johnson in nearby Marshall for tapping the till, stealing money, from the Review and Herald Press. Various employees who knew about his theft were prepared to testify in court against him. Now, given previous cases of theft that we know about, thanks to George Amadon's diaries, which are fascinating reading, this particular case seems plausible. However, it is worth mentioning that no other Battle Creek newspaper covered any of the above-mentioned stories included in Brown's Three Moon newspapers. Probably because, although salacious reporting and providing alternative facts and fake news sold newspapers in the short term, they did not gain citizens' respect in the long run. In conclusion, between 1855 and 1890, Adventists in Battle Creek gradually adapted to their environment. In the 1850s and 60s, they were seen as an isolated sect of Gizzardites living in the West End Canaan. By the 1870s and 80s, however, their growing involvement in the life of Battle Creek gained them both favorable and unfavorable attention in the local press. Despite their determination to be in the world, but not of the world, however, Adventist participation in politics, musical groups, patriotic activities, cultural events, and social organizations gradually transformed both them and the public's attitude toward Adventists in Battle Creek. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next presentation is by Kevin Burton. Kevin Burton is a PhD student in the American Religious History program at Florida State University. He has taught at Andrews University, including creating an online course on learning historical shorthand, and he currently teaches religion in the United States at Florida State University. He has presented several papers at scholarly conventions and published a number of scholarly articles and book reviews. His MA thesis was a study of influential early Adventist pioneer and General Conference President George Butler. His current research projects focus on Seventh-day Adventist involvement in eugenics, Jesuit infiltration and other conspiracy theories, and Adventism and material culture. Here he will present on the following subject: situating views on military service, Seventh-day Adventist soldiers, and the Church's political rhetoric during the Civil War.
Thank you very much, Denis, and everyone else who's here. It's an honor and privilege to be a part of this wonderful conference, and so hopefully we'll get give you something more to think about here that you'll appreciate. Numerous scholars have argued that premillennialist religious groups do not participate in nationalist projects such as voluntary military service. Such groups have been labeled apocalyptic pacifists based on the assumption that premillennialist and pacifist beliefs necessarily go together. Since Seventh-day Adventists have advocated premillennialist views since the mid-19th century, scholars have argued that they did not voluntarily participate in the Civil War. Peter Brock popularized this interpretation in his 1968 Princeton University Press book, Pacifism in the United States, and subsequent scholars have agreed that Adventists did not voluntarily participate in the Civil War, and that those that did so were all disfellowshipped. Several scholars also argue that the Seventh-day Adventist Church began as a peace church to the same degree as Quakers, Mennonites, and other religious communities committed to the ethics of nonviolence. This notion has become widespread to the point that the Adventist Church is listed as a historic peace church on Wikipedia.com. Matthew Sutton has recently critiqued the notion that conservative apocalypticism is tied to inaction. According to Sutton, conservative Christians' apocalyptic sensibilities instilled in them a sense of determination that demanded constant action. All of their resources must be used to prepare themselves and the world for the return of Christ. Preparatory actions often took overt social and political forms, and conservative apocalypticists had no time or regard for incremental change. They called for drastic and immediate solutions to the problems they saw around them. I fully agree with Sutton's analysis, but I want to take his critique further. In this paper, I argue that conservative premillennialists often participated in the exact same social reforms and nationalist projects as other Americans. This paper focuses on Seventh-day Adventists in the Civil War era as a way to address the larger theoretical assumption that permeate the historiography of this tradition and others with similar eschatological views, namely that apocalypticism prohibits people from participating in nationalist projects in the same manner as other Americans. My research also provides a fuller perspective regarding the issue of non-combatants in the Adventist Church, because I have found that numerous Adventist soldiers did, in fact, voluntarily enlist as combatant soldiers in the Civil War. Since the Adventist Church was officially recognized as a peace church, this paper unravels the political maneuvering denominational leaders employed to gain such status. In conclusion, I argue that the Adventist Church was never truly a peace church in the same sense as Quakers and Mennonites. Though the United States government gave the Adventists this status, non-participation was far from the consensus view. Rather, Adventist leaders sought to gain this recognition so that Adventists conscientiously opposed to taking human life or violating the Sabbath could have the option to serve their nation as cooperators. Adventists were generally pro-unionist, and several were active abolitionists, including William Gifford and John Byington, who operated stations on the Underground Railroad. Not surprisingly, therefore, all identified Adventist soldiers served in the Union Army. There were a few Adventists, such as Alexander Ross, who held pro-slavery principles, and though none of these men were known to join the Confederate Army, it is possible that some Adventists went beyond mere talk to defend slavery, although I would say they're very much in the minority. The precise number of Adventist soldiers that served in the Civil War is unknown, but enough data has been recovered to provide a good estimate. Sources lacking quantitative data are revealing. First, several Adventist churches were drastically reduced in size, filled only with female members, or entirely disbanded because the men enlisted in the army. Second, published letters and ministerial reports indicate that numerous men did volunteer, but these sources lack the adequate information to count or identify the soldiers. Third, Adventist leaders admitted that various members had voluntarily enlisted and wrote articles to dissuade others from following suit. In addition to these types of sources, I have identified over 70 Adventist soldiers by name, 55 volunteers, 13 draftees, and 5 converts who continued to participate in the war after their conversion. Considering all of the available data, I therefore conservatively estimate that at least 200 Adventists voluntarily enlisted and that at minimum another 200 were drafted. Though these numbers are small, it is important to note that there were about 3,500 Adventists at the time. These estimates then suggest that at least 10% of all members, of all demographics, age, etc., served in the Army, and that if a quarter of them, and that's a big if, were men of military age, then approximately half of them served in the military. Significantly, these estimates correspond with the estimates of Northerners who served in the Union during the war. The population of the North hovered around 22 million persons in the early 1860s, and between 2.1 and 2.6 million of them served in the war. It is evident, therefore, that about 10% of all Northern citizens, again of all demographics and ages, served in the Union Army. Seventh-day Adventists were likely at this mark as well, indicating that the patriotism of these apocalyptic Christians was on par with the rest of the citizens in the Union. On April 12, 1861, Confederate troops began to fire on Fort Sumter, and 3 days later, Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to serve a 3-month period. Thousands of Northerners promptly answered the President's request for troops, including several Adventists. William Harold, for example, enlisted on April 24, only 10 days after Lincoln's call for volunteers. And other Adventists promptly enlisted as well, such as George A.S. Goddard, who enlisted on May 3, Charles C. Drown, May 23, William R. Carpenter, June 27, and Benjamin Seward, June 19. Many Adventists who enlisted in 1861 fought all 4 years in the war. Harold, Goddard, Drown, and another soldier named William T. Seward all did so. Adventists also began to die during the first year of war. George S. Blakely, for example, enlisted on August 14, 1861, and was in his grave before the calendar could change to 1862. On April 3, 1862, Edwin Stanton wrote General Order 33 and discontinued the recruiting service for the Union, effectively ending the first wave of Northern volunteerism. Though Stanton rescinded this order on June 6, 1862, enthusiasm had waned since the previous year. Lincoln became more desperate when fewer men volunteered to fight, and as a result, he signed the Militia Act of 1862 on July 17. Each state governor now had a quota of militiamen to fill, and if they failed, the president was empowered to draft soldiers. Though the states usually met their quota with little or no drafting, the Militia Act was an important step toward national conscription. This new act was first tested on August 4, 1862, when Stanton called for 300,000 additional troops, giving the states until only August 15 to fill their quotas through volunteerism. Two of the co-founders of the Adventist Church, James and Ellen White, were in Iowa at the time that this news was published and were surprised, as Ron Graybill has stated, to discover that Adventists in the area were, quote, under suspicion as being in sympathy with the rebellion because of their anti-war views. In response to Stanton's call and Iowan Adventist reaction, James White wrote an editorial titled The Nation that appeared in the Review on August 12. In this piece, White offered his opinion about what Adventists should do if they were drafted, an opinion that some Adventists found highly controversial. The primary point of contention was White's reasoning that, quote, in the case of drafting, the government assumes the responsibility of the violation of the law of God, and it would be madness to resist, end quote. This comment was directly aimed at Adventists in and around Marion, Iowa, who were strict, non-participatory pacifists. To White, this stance was fanatical and extreme, and he tried to reason with these Adventists by assuring them that the present war was not the fulfillment of the prophecies found in Revelation. When these prophecies were fulfilled, White argued, martyrdom would be an acceptable option, but this was not the case in the 1860s. Numerous Adventists wrote to the Review in response to White's article throughout the remainder of the year. Most respondents were in essential agreement with White, with views reflecting a via media response to the draft, something like conscientious cooperation. Adventist views ranged, however, from non-cooperation on one end of the spectrum to full-fledged combatancy on the other. Joseph Clark, who was too old to enlist, but probably would have done so if he was younger, published a representative Adventist response in favor of combatancy, which he also directed at Adventist pacifists in Iowa. For combatants like Clark, participation in war did not necessitate that Adventists break commandments or give up their faith in Christ's imminent return. Rather, he wanted to see, quote, a regiment of Sabbath-keepers strike this rebellion a staggering blow in the strength of him who always helped his valiant people when they kept his statutes, end quote. In Clark's opinion, soldiers could keep the Sabbath during wartime because the Israelites kept God's Sabbath while they fought against their enemies. Similarly, killing was not a violation of God's law because the people in the Old and New Testament, such as Joshua or David, killed with God's approval. Clark therefore encouraged Northerners to act like men and fight, and prayed that God would destroy the Confederacy. He wrote in the Republican Weekly Perrysburg, Ohio Journal, quote, let union against Southern perfidy pervade all hearts. May the God of battle speed the arrow to the heart of treason and give aid and comfort to the chief executive, that's God in capital letters, and his true-hearted supporters in the present great struggle, end quote. Adventist leaders made no formal statements regarding military service prior to the late summer of 1864. Congress passed the Enrollment Act on March 3, 1863, and larger numbers of Adventists began to be drafted, although some had been drafted since late 1862. But anyone opposed to military service could furnish a substitute or pay a commutation fee to provide a soldier in their stead. Adventists regularly took advantage of this policy in 1863 and in 1864. I've identified several of those members as well. But when Congress amended its conscription laws in 1864, Adventist leaders were forced to take new measures to provide this option to members. On February 24, 1864, an amendment to the Enrollment Act provided Christians with membership in a recognized peace church the option of serving in the military in a non-combatant role. Section 17 of the amended Enrollment Act specified that peace churches had to demonstrate, quote, by rules and articles of faith and practice that all of its members were conscientiously opposed to military service, end quote. If all members were not, quote, uniformly consistent in this faith, the government would not recognize that religious body as a peace church. Though the amendment outlined rules to test the sincerity of peace churches, any Northerner could still pay the commutation fee to avoid military service if he wished to do so. This ended on July 4, 1864, however, when a further revision to the Enrollment Act specified that only members of recognized peace churches could pay the commutation fee and avoid the draft. As Peter Brock has correctly observed, Seventh-day Adventists did not at first, even after the February 1864 amendment, insist on their recognition as a non-combatant denomination within the meaning of the Act, end quote. Rather, Adventist leaders sought this status only after the amendment on July 4 took away their privilege of paying the commutation fee. Acting promptly, the officers of the General Conference began to secure documents from various civic leaders in early August 1864. By the end of the month, they had forwarded these documents to J. N. Andrews and arranged for him to meet with Provost Marshal General James B. Fry in Washington, D.C. Andrews left on August 29 and reported that his mission was successful in mid-September. An analysis of the process leading to Andrews' success reveals much in regard to the politicking involved in gaining this recognition. As specified in Section 17 of the February 24 Amendment to the Enrollment Act, religious bodies would only be recognized as a peace church if they passed a corporate sincerity test which specified that the denomination had to demonstrate that its members were, quote, uniformly consistent in practice regarding their non-combatant views. The Adventists were concerned that they would not be recognized as a peace church because they had recently finalized their organization in May 1863. Their greatest challenge was the fact that Adventists were not uniformly consistent in their views regarding the war. In practice, numerous Adventists had voluntarily enlisted since April 1861, while others had paid the commutation fee since the early fall of 1862. By 1865, it is very likely that hundreds of Adventists were serving in the Army and that the majority served as combatants either willingly or unwillingly, because most non-combatants or draftees had to serve as combatants. Adventist leaders overcame this obstacle by bending the truth. When the General Conference officers wrote to governmental officials to get documentation for Andrews' trip to Washington, they claimed that Adventists were, quote, this is Adventists now speaking, they claimed, quote, that Adventists were unanimous in their views that its teachings are contrary to the spirit and practice of war. Hence, they have ever been conscientiously opposed to bearing arms, end quote. Adventist leaders were also disingenuous in claiming that denominational, quote, practice has uniformly been consistent with these principles of peace, and that the Adventist people have not felt free to enlist into the service, end quote. Though this was clearly not the case, the General Conference officers were in a bind. They knew that if they would only be recognized as a peace church if they utilized the same verbiage of Section 17 of the Amendment to the Enrollment Act, if they did not specifically state that Adventists had been uniform in practice, their request for recognition as a peace church would have been rejected. In the midst of this ethical dilemma, Adventist leaders demonstrated their willingness to present selective information so that their Adventist members could have the option of keeping the 4th and 6th commandments. In spite of reality, these documents were accepted as genuine, and the nation's leaders granted Adventists non-combatant status. Just prior to Andrews' mission to Washington, Adventist leaders had published a pamphlet for draftees to give to their commanding officers, which was commonly known by a short title, The Draft. With this publication, Adventist soldiers now had documentation that proved their, quote, unanimous position as a peace church. Hundreds of members of this peace church were fighting, however, and several Army officers likely knew it. This presumably contributed to the difficulties that numerous Adventist draftees faced when they tried to secure non-combatant positions in the Army. In response to this issue, Andrews sought counsel from Roswell Hart, Provost Marshal of the 28th District of New York, and relayed Hart's recommendation to Adventists through the review on February 7th. In his article, Andrews suggested that several documents be prepared and sent to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, including a prepared statement from the General Conference Committee, quote, in the name of our entire people, a copy of the draft that is, and several issues of the review that highlighted the pacifist position and the struggles of non-combatant Adventist soldiers in the war. Adventist leaders followed Andrews' advice in spades by preparing additional documentation to make their case even stronger. These new documents were prepared within a month, specifically for the eyes of Edwin Stanton and his subordinates at the nation's capital. These documents included notarized statements by 4 denominational leaders, that's James White, Uriah Smith, John Byington, conference president, and George Amadon, 2 additional pamphlets, and the March 7, 1865 issue of the Review and Herald. The first tract was essentially a lengthened version of the previous tract, the draft, and the second tract contained a select perspective of articles printed in the Review that emphasized peace and the Adventist belief in the Sabbath. Not surprisingly, articles in favor of war, such as those written by Joseph Clark, and articles in ministerial reports that revealed that Adventists had indeed voluntarily enlisted in the Army, were not included in the pamphlet. Though these pamphlets were important components in the Adventist case, the most significant document, at least in my opinion, prepared for Edwin Stanton was the March 7, 1865 issue of the Review. This issue was filled with articles and notices that demonstrated the Adventist unanimity opposed to combat, and also the genuine unanimity of Adventists who were observing the Seventh-day Sabbath. The latter point was emphasized through numerous reports from Adventist ministers. Normally, ministerial reports appeared between pages 4 and 6 of the review, but this special issue was different. It featured a report of A.S. Hutchins on the front page. Not only was it abnormal for a ministerial report to appear on the front page, a place typically reserved for a theological treatise or sermon, but this report also emphasized the Sabbath in an important manner. In addition to the typical mention of numerous meetings conducted on the Sabbath, and in this case they actually say the date, the Sabbath, the date, the Sabbath, and there's like 20 of them. There's a lot. Hutchins' report also showcased his conversion from the Free Will Baptist faith to the Sabbatarian Adventism in 1851, a 14-year-old event perhaps recounted for political purposes in 1865. Several other reports featuring the Sabbath were also printed, including 2 on the atypical page 2, 3 more on the typical page 6, and 4 notices about forthcoming meetings on the Sabbath on the back page of the review. Articles that outlined supposed agreement on the topic of non-combatancy accompanied reports emphasizing the Sabbath. In easy-to-read bullet point fashion, George W. Amadon outlined 8 reasons why Adventists did not engage in war, and in a companion article, he stated, quote, "The position of Seventh-day Adventists in reference to war is that it is a great moral evil and contrary to the teachings and spirit of the Bible," end quote. Most significantly, however, was the inclusion of some items on the back page of the review, 2 of which were stylized to catch readers' attention with the bold title, "Notice." These 2 items related to church discipline and featured the cases of 2 Adventist men who had voluntarily enlisted in the army and were subsequently disfellowshipped. These notices ensured that if Edwin Stanton knew that hundreds of Adventist men had in fact voluntarily enlisted in the war, he would be led to assume that Adventist churches uniformly removed such members from their midst, hence removing any doubt that Adventists were opposed to war and violence. I could go into a lot more detail about the other things surrounding these cases. But I'll have to summarize and say this for now. Subsequent historians have accepted these 2 cases of disfellowshipping as representative of the Adventist response to voluntary enlistment, arguing that those Adventists who did enlist were all disfellowshipped. And those are the only 2 cases in the review that are pointed out on that one issue. Adventist leaders never formally pressured churches to disfellowship their members who enlisted, however, and many churches retained members while others disciplined members in an uneven fashion, and I could go into more detail about this. Such diversity in action reveals that though Adventists now had governmental recognition as a peace church, they were still far from uniform in regard to their response to war. In spite of gaining official recognition as a peace church, Adventists in the 1860s knew that they were not uniformly consistent in response to war. Hundreds of Adventists served in the army, either willingly or unwillingly, and as a result, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was a fighting peace church. This reality led to major internal battles within the denomination, something I think has been overlooked as well. An Adventist ecclesiastical rebellion erupted during the war, and a schism took place between 1863 and 1866. Extreme pacifists from in and around Marion, Iowa, were highly displeased with the official Adventist response to the war and began to dissent in reaction to their brethren who served as conscientious cooperators and combatants. The signs of the times led dissenters, known by Adventists as the Marian Party, to interpret John's revelation in a different manner than the mainline church. These interpretations were intimately connected with strict pacifism. Benjamin F. Snook, William H. Brinkerhoff, and Henry E. Carver led the schismatic party, and they were particularly upset with James and Ellen White because they did not promote non-participatory stance regarding war. It is not surprising, therefore, as Robert Coulter has noted, that, quote, when the Iowans appealed to James White for support, he said that if he published material supporting pacifism in the review, angry protesters would burn its office to the ground, end quote. Furthermore, White's article, The Nation, did not support pacifism, and the Iowans, such as Carver, were infuriated that Ellen White supported her husband's position. As Carver stated, this fact, quote, bore heavily in my mind against her claims to divine inspiration. Usually we talk about this controversy as starting because people are rejecting Ellen White. the reason that many of these people are rejecting her is because she is not supporting pacifism, and Carver says this reason alone would cause me to believe that she is no longer a prophet. Disagreements continued throughout the war. In the fall of 1862, the Iowans petitioned their state government for non-combatant status, some 2 years before denominational leaders sought the same status for the corporate body. This petition, however, was unsanctioned by the leaders at Battle Creek, and the whites denounced it as fanaticism. While the Iowans tried to distance themselves from the war, leaders in Battle Creek drew closer to it. In October 1862, James White, along with fellow Adventist J.P. Kellogg, began to actively support the war effort in Battle Creek, Michigan, as elected members of a civic committee chosen to raise money for bounties to entice more men to volunteer. The Iowans and denominational leaders in Battle Creek held different views regarding the war, which soon led to a formal split. In the end, dozens of Adventists were disfellowshipped, and I have way more Adventists by name who were disfellowshipped from the Marian Party than I do that were soldiers. Conclusion. Adventist leaders were not interested in establishing a uniform position in regard to war. General Conference officers only sought non-combatant status when the July 4, 1864 amendment to the Enrollment Act took away the privilege of military exemption through payment of the commutation fee. Though Adventist leaders wanted to give all members the option to avoid military service, they were primarily interested in safeguarding Adventist ministers. James White supported this concept of raising funds for Adventists generally, but admitted, in their view, that he was particularly, quote, in favor of raising a fund for the benefit of our efficient preachers who are liable to the draft. And then he further on goes on to request from every Adventist member that they donate $100 for that purpose alone, just to save the ministers. Aside from Adventists who were drafted, it seems that at least 200 voluntarily enlisted in the service. Many Adventist members were not pleased to see their family and friends willingly join the army, and they tried to persuade them not to do so. And ministers typically discouraged voluntarily enlistment by employing a doctrinal reasoning, and when their efforts failed, they complained that in light of the, quote, political excitement of the times, people seem to think that they have but very little time to look to the interests in reference to the world to come, end quote. This argument was premised on a false dichotomy, I think. The voluntary enlistment was indicative that the false dichotomy, of course, is that the voluntary enlistment was indicative of disinterest in premillennial apocalyptic beliefs. Yet patriotism was not the antithesis of premillennialism. And I could go into lots of details about all the acts that Adventists did to try to keep the Sabbath and all their evangelism that they did during the Civil War, which is a totally fascinating thing, which I can't do at this time. Numerous Adventist volunteers upheld their Christian beliefs while they served in the military and even evangelized to their friends in the process. These men presumably reasoned, like Joseph Clark, that they, like the Israelites of old, could keep God's commandments while participating in nationalist projects, in particular war. These soldiers did not give up their belief in the imminent return of Jesus Christ in the process. Some did, though, but not all of them. But they likely agreed with James White that the present conflict was not equivalent to the Battle of Armageddon. It is also important to emphasize that Adventists who voluntarily participated in the Civil War were not uniformly disfellowshipped. Many were, but in reality it is likely that more Adventists who held non-participatory views were disfellowshipped. These individuals did not lose their membership because of their pacifism. The split was rooted, however, in disagreements between non-participation and conscientious cooperation. The pacifists in Iowa began to distrust the whites' leadership because they were not pacifists. This led to a schism and eventually a new denomination known as the Church of God's Seventh Day. The contrast between combatants and pacifists who were disfellowshipped reveals that early Adventist leaders were predominantly in favor of conscientious cooperation. Scholars have suggested, however, that the Adventists took the position of conscientious cooperation in the 20th century. The actions of Adventists in the Civil War era tell a different story, however. The denomination was never as united on the doctrine of pacifism as Anabaptists and Quakers were. Hundreds of Adventists supported the war effort either in the military or at home. They passed on their patriotism to future generations as well. Seventh-day Adventists, therefore, from the earliest years have willingly participated in nationalist projects in the same manner as other Americans while maintaining their belief that Jesus will return to the earth very soon.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Our next presenter is Michel Sunhae. She is a PhD candidate in religious studies at the University of Texas at Austin, where she studies religion in the Americas. Previously, she completed a BA in History and East Asian Studies and an MA in History from Stanford University. And she's writing her dissertation on contestations over Sabbath-keeping practices and discourse amongst Protestant and Jewish communities in the late 19th and early 20th century United States. She's particularly interested in theories of sacred time and religious contestations in the American West. And her presentation today is on sacred time and Sabbath-keeping in late 19th century American culture. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I am focusing in this paper on a specific aspect of Sabbath-keeping contestations, particularly in California, and so I welcome your feedback. So here we go. Beginning in the early 19th century, white American Protestant clergy and laity rallied around several moral reform issues, including that of Sunday Sabbatarianism, forming what Gaines Foster has called the Christian lobby. But when it comes to Sabbatarianism, the scholarship on this topic has largely focused on the Eastern Seaboard and on issues of mail delivery, train schedules, and large-scale events like the 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition. But I'd like to shift our attention to one specific and I believe important dimension, the oral or sound dimension of this moral reform effort in the late 19th century. Religious sound and noise should be understood not only in reference to how loud it is, but how it crosses the bounds of what was determined to be temporally and spatially appropriate. In his 2014 study of the history of sound and American religion, anthropologist Isaac Weiner argues that noise demarcates difference, threats to a dominant social order. That is, when we think about sound in the context of American religion, we are speaking of how people have determined what is acceptable sound and what is not, and more broadly, what is acceptable religion and what is not. Sound takes us into the ways in which religious pluralism has been negotiated in American history. But while the American Religious Sounds project that Weiner heads up points us primarily to what fills the sonic space, I want to look today at claims about the absence of sound, and more specifically noise, sound that takes on a negative qualitative dimension. In this paper, I'd like to focus on mid to late 19th century Sabbatarianism by looking at one of the important key ways in which dominant ideas about the Sabbath were signified. And when I say Sabbath, sometimes I'm referring to the Saturday or Seventh-day Sabbath, and sometimes to the Sunday Sabbath. And so I'll try to specify what I'm talking about in each instance. So one of the important key ways in which dominant ideas about the Sabbath were signified through discourse about, quote, Sabbath quiet. I suggest that the Sabbath quiet ideal that Sunday-keeping moral reformers generated is one way into understanding contestations over Sabbath-keeping in 19th century America. Moreover, this aspect of Sabbatarian moral reform efforts pushes us to think about contestations over the Sabbath, however you define it, not only as a matter of legislation or regulation, but as a matter of various metaphysical claims about sound and time that Sabbatarians made during this period. So first, I'd like to briefly talk about, first, the meaning of Sabbath quiet, and second, the ways in which it was employed as a signifier of a larger moral vision in 19th century America. Sabbath quiet had a multivalent meaning in this period. First, Sabbath quiet, this phrase, signified an exercise in Christian introspection and reflection. In 1880, congregational preacher Leonard Bacon wrote, "A Sabbath-keeping people will become a thoughtful people," adding, "A true Sabbath is something far more restful than a day of noisy jollity. In its calm air, the mind rests by thought, not thoughtlessness, by quiet musing." Sabbath was quiet because it was a day to think about otherworldly things. As I'll discuss later, with this definition, the Adventists may have identified. However, second, a quiet Sabbath evoked notions of gentility that were moored in class. Newspapers often reported of a prominent figure spending a, quote, quiet Sabbath by going to church rather than engaging in diplomatic or business activity. For example, on the 4th of May 1903, it was reported in the San Francisco Daily that King Edward had spent a quiet Sabbath in Paris. He, quote, took a short stroll on his way to church. Crowds of people gathered at the British Embassy and along the thoroughfare where he passed and gave mild demonstrations of goodwill. Sabbath quiet evoked a white Protestant sense of acceptable behavior. And lastly, Sabbath quiet denoted the absence of un-Sabbath-like activities. It was largely defined over and against the proliferation of commercial and industrial activity. In the Sunday Sabbatarian imagination, the main thoroughfares, the San Francisco docks, entire business districts were to be silenced. Of course, Sabbath quiet did not mean the absence of hymn singing or Sabbath school teaching or other acceptable sounds. Instead, quiet signified the limits between acceptable and unacceptable Sunday activity and sound. You could read Sabbath quiet as merely an ethos evoked in literature, a phrase symbolic of the experience of the first day. The Sausalito News reprinted a poem in 1909 about old mothers that compared the Sabbath to a mother's, quote, quiet grace. And perhaps you've heard the hymn published in 1884 called Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, based on a longer poem by American Quaker poet John Greenleaf Whittier that included these words, O Sabbath rest by Galilee, O calm of hills above, where Jesus knelt to share with thee the silence of eternity, interpreted by love. But Sabbath quiet took on a more global, aggressive meaning in Protestant discourse about moral reform in a Christian society. By the late 19th century, the staid Sabbath of Laura Ingalls Wilder's grandfather, if any of you can remember that chapter with the pig and the quiet Sabbath, was coming under the threat of secularization, urbanization, commercialization, industrialization, and diversification of the population. Proponents of Sunday Sabbatarianism changed tack from arguing for Sabbath observance with a basis in a Puritan reading of the Ten Commandments to that of a civil Sabbath. In this context, Sabbath quiet came to denote a broad social and moral vision. Now on to California, where I'd like to primarily locate my study. California was a place that entered the Union without a strong historic Protestant establishment, as many of us know. Demographically, it was a rapidly changing and racially and religiously diverse place. As the Chilean diplomat Vicente Pérez Rosales, a sort of Tocquevillian observer of California, put it, it was el mundo en miniatura, de iglesias de todas denominaciones. Excuse me, my Spanish is rusty. The seeming secularity, religious diversity, and/or lawlessness of bolder society ushered in efforts at the regulation of morality by Protestant clergy, educators, and missionaries. Statehood, demographic changes, and the professionalization of mining lent greater stability to California society and made possible moral reforms. And efforts at raising a beacon of Christian morality in the young state included deep concern about the desecration of the sacred Sunday. As one minister wrote in 1885, will New England's restful and worshipful Sabbath extend its leaven at last to the Pacific coast, or will Cincinnati's convivial and commercial Sunday cyclone its way to the Pacific? The law was the primary recourse for imposing moral order in the young state. In response to perceived violations of the Sunday Sabbath, in 1855, the state legislature passed a law prohibiting what it called, quote, barbarous and noisy amusements on the Christian Sabbath, a law about noise in one respect. Under this law, individuals were prohibited from selling milk, fish, or fresh meat after 10 o'clock a.m. on Sundays. It was also amended a little while later to prohibit anyone from helping in running a, quote, bull, bear, cock, or prize fight, race, circus, bowling alley, gambling house, room, or saloon, or any place of noisy or barbarous amusement on the Sabbath day. City officials also passed local noise laws in Sacramento and San Francisco during this time to similar effect. So Protestant and state leaders set up a contrast between noise, which meant desecration, with the civilian ideal of Sabbath quiet. One writer for the Christian Observer in 1850 complained that Sunday in California was a day for, quote, the practice of all sorts of wickedness. The evidence of this wickedness that he gave was noise, the din of saloons, outdoor markets, drunken men, and parties. Sabbath desecration could also come from the sound of work. For example, churchgoers at the First Church of the United Brethren in Christ at the corner of Hope and Pico Streets in LA reported they requested that the city council forbid a labor festival from running on Sunday because of its noise. And a larger issue on which Sunday Sabbatarians were outspoken nationwide, of course, was that of newspaper crying on Sundays. Moreover, if we understand Sabbath quiet to be a signifier for a civilized Protestant moral order, then it is not unsurprising that many also associated Sunday noise with foreigners. One journal noted in 1850, Sunday night is the night for the Chilenos, Mexicans, and Kanakas, a term for Hawaiians, in San Francisco. Fandangos in which rowdy Americans participate abound in the outskirts of the city, and at there, knives and pistols are often brought into requisition. The cacophony of Sunday lawlessness disturbed one Methodist preacher in Sonoma, north of San Francisco, who reported that he could, quote, distinctly hear the trundling of the balls in a 10-pin alley during his Sunday sermon. He continued, quote, there was also much noise and shouting about the streets. Much delight was also manifested in the attempt of some Spaniards to drive several calves into an adjoining corral. One Sunday Sabbatarian remarked that European immigrants who worked as liquor sellers exerted a brazen despotism in desecrating Sundays. And another protested, the heathen may just as well understand now that we are going to have a quiet Christian Sunday in this country, and if they do not like it, they can immigrate to the heathen countries from which most of them came. The idea of the Sabbath quiet then signified not just a concern with noise, but with the ways in which American society, and not to mention California society, which they consider to be even more wild, was rapidly diversifying. In their discourse about the sacralization of the sound space, Protestant moral reformers presented a vision for a Christian civilization. In the wake of Sunday noise laws in California, and indeed across the country, the Journal of Commerce, for example, reported that churchgoers had finally enjoyed a quiet Sabbath in a, quote, long period of years, silent, tranquil, solemn, and eloquent tribute to an enlightened Christian civilization, end quote. A visitor to San Francisco reported that he no longer heard the sound of the hammer, nor the saw, nor the gambling shops, what he called hells on earth, during his stay there. Thankfully, hell could be quieted on the Sabbath day. But efforts to enforce Sabbath quiet did not go uncontested, and this is where I'd like to talk about Seventh-day Adventists for a moment. The Sunday laws passed in the 1850s in California came under almost immediate contest in court as individuals, including Willie White, were arrested for Sabbath breaking. By 1882, dissenting juries refused to convict Sunday violators, who were being rounded up in increasingly large batches by city law enforcement. I think between March and June of 1882, there are 1,600 Sunday violators that are rounded up in the state of California alone. And it's sort of left up to the discretion of local policemen to decide whether or not they want to enforce the law, and by 1882 they definitely are. Republicans who disagreed with the Sunday laws, including many Seventh-day Adventists, voted Democrat in the statewide elections that year. Amidst the tumult, the California state legislature repealed all laws regarding Sunday observance in 1883, becoming the first state in the United States to do so. And in response to the National Christian Lobby for Sunday-keeping, Adventists launched the monthly publication with which most of us are familiar, the American Sentinel, in 1886, which was edited by J.H. Wagner, along with E.J. Wagner and A.T. Jones out of Oakland. Seventh-day Adventists received particular attention in the quest for quiet Sabbaths by Protestant moral reformers. The Christian Statesman in 1894 called Saturday Sabbath keepers, quote, the worst enemies of the Lord's Day we have to contend with in our efforts to secure a quiet Sabbath. But what did Adventists themselves think about quiet Sabbath as Sabbath keepers themselves? Interestingly, neither Ellen White nor these editors nor other Adventists from this period seem to have very frequently even employed the term Sabbath quiet or quiet Sabbath, at least in their published writings. Yes, Ellen White did make various references to rest and quiet on Sabbaths. From what I see, she employed the term Sabbath quiet itself once. Writing about the demon-possessed maniac in Luke 4, she wrote that he, quote, disturbed the Sabbath quiet of the synagogue in Capernaum and was healed by the compassionate Savior. And this is found in the Great Controversy. She also remarked on the order and quiet of certain meetings or its importance in homemaking and childbearing. However, the idea of quiet as a broad civilizational ideal to be enforced cannot be found in her writings, nor those of her Adventist contemporaries from what I've found. Primarily, they employed this phrase only in reference to the efforts of Sunday Sabbatarians. They understood Sabbath quiet to be shorthand for enforced rest, quoting in the American Sentinel various Sunday Sabbatarian moral reformers who used this phrase. But Adventists didn't completely contest efforts at enforcing a Sabbath quiet. Instead, editors of the American Sentinel also emphasized that Adventists were a quiet, unobtrusive people. They pointed out the irony of arresting Adventists when there were many others who were much noisier as a disturbance to the Sabbath quiet than they. Adventists may have not kept Sunday as the Sabbath, but they, quote, did nothing but quiet, orderly, private work while the railroad men, the iron men, the livery stable men, and Sunday fruit pickers enjoyed much greater leeway with noise laws. In this way, they asked Sunday Sabbatarians to more objectively consider the actual sonic landscape. How could, if Sunday keepers were to make a consistent argument, they accept objectively loud noises on Sabbath while arresting a relatively quiet people? In other words, they offered empirically grounded objections to the way in which the Sabbath quiet publicly reified certain forms of acceptable and unacceptable noise. Sunday Sabbatarians' complaints about noise show the expansiveness of the claim they wanted to lay to society at the time. With the notion of Sabbath quiet, they signified broader ambitions to make a Christian society. Furthermore, they showed that their project of moral reform was a multidimensional one, extending into the sound environment. If you think about it, it's quite a boggling thought for two reasons. First, both sound and time are uncontainable. No matter how you may divide it or conceptualize it, time is a metaphysical fact, and it rolls forward for everyone in one way or another. Similarly, sound often transgresses man-made institutions and intents. The fact that they were interested in trying to legislate and police time and sound is astounding to me. Second, they were interested in a sacralization of something we don't necessarily consider religious, the sound environment, which plays with what the boundaries of the sacred and secular are. But back to the Adventists. When we look at Adventist responses to claims about the Sabbath quiet, we see that they countered these metaphysical ambitions by suggesting that it was an empirically inconsistent construction. Instead, Adventists argued that the Sabbath quiet was to be entered into individually and internally. In response to Sunday noise laws, Sentinel editors wrote that the quiet was an individual experience that mattered little on the actual oral landscape, writing, quote, "He who spends the Sabbath day with God will enjoy a quiet and restful Sabbath, whether anyone else around him is at rest or not. The right to do that which God commands can be solely claimed by any individual without reliance upon any other power than God." For my reading of the American Sentinel, Adventists offered their own individual, internal, subjective definition of the Sabbath quiet that sidestepped the more metaphysical claims that majority American Protestants were making with the term in the late 19th century. But I'd like to end this paper by asking a series of questions for which I hope you'll help provide some answers. Have Adventist hymnody, the sound of a woman preaching, the knocking of a coal porter on a door, or other sonic moments in Adventist history served to contest majority Protestant claims in other ways? How have Adventists filled sonic space historically, both in America and abroad? I know worship styles also vary across cultures and regions and time periods, and so that's one question that's interesting to me in particular. What constitutes noise and sound for Adventists historically? More broadly, how can looking at the history of Seventh-day Adventism help us to understand religious sound, the history of Sabbath-keeping, and/or the rise of diverse religious voices? If looking at the late 19th century notion of Sabbath quiet is any indication, Adventists did make some noise about these topics. Thank you.
Our last presenter is Edward Allen. Dr. Allen is professor at Union College, and he spent part of his childhood in the Philippines as part of a missionary family in the 1960s and attended Far Eastern Academy for 2 years. After spending 30 years in pastoral ministry, he began teaching at Union College in 2005 and has been there for the last 13 years. He completed his PhD in church history at Fuller Theological Seminary in 2008 and currently serves as chair of the Division of Religion at Union College. From 2013 to 2016, he was president of the Association of Seventh-day Adventist Historians. His paper is titled "The Student Volunteer Movement as Context for Seventh-day Adventist Missions."
The broad story of Seventh-day Adventist missions has been told, but not recently and not scholarly. There has been a great deal of excellent work that's been done on particular geographical areas for Seventh-day Adventist missions. but a broad, thoroughly scholarly summary of Adventist mission history has not yet been written. A few, if any, Adventist histories describe the participation of Seventh-day Adventists in the broad Protestant missions movement known as the Student Volunteer Movement. It is as if Adventist missions occurred in a complete vacuum. In fact, Seventh-day Adventists' participation in the Student Volunteer Movement was early, it was deep, and it was long-lasting. After introducing the Student Volunteer Movement, this paper will describe the nature of Adventist participation in that movement and suggest some lessons to be learned. In summer of 1886, Dwight L. Moody invited 251 students to attend a conference at Northfield, Massachusetts on personal evangelism. Unplanned addresses at the conference highlighted the need for foreign missions. By the close of the conference, 100 men, and they were all men, signed the pledge of the Princeton University Foreign Missionary Society, and this pledge is important. It read, "We, the undersigned, declare ourselves willing and desirous, God permitting, to go to the unevangelized portions of the world." That pledge and ones like it, even the whole idea of making such a declaration, became an important element in recruiting college students to foreign missions, not only in mainstream colleges in the late 19th and 20th centuries, but in Seventh-day Adventist educational institutions up until nearly the present time. The events in Northfield in the summer in 1886 became significant because the Mount Hermon 100 chose to set up a means to carry on the challenge of the conference to colleges and universities throughout the United States. 2 of the 100 dedicated themselves to visiting college campuses during the next year in order to recruit more students to foreign missions. That pattern of visiting college campuses continued for nearly 60 years. At each campus, the traveling secretaries organized foreign mission bands, and we'll hear much about that in a moment. Those foreign mission bands were to retain the commitment of students and eventually to educate recruits for mission service. Beginning in 1890, Seventh-day Adventists began organizing foreign mission bands based on this model. Some of the Adventist bands were officially connected to the movement, and some used the tools and materials of the movement without an official connection. The organization that resulted from the Mount Hermon experience became known as the Student Volunteer Movement for Foreign Missions, shorthand SVM. During his first 25 years, he was under the incredibly capable leadership of John R. Mott, who eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work of reconciliation in Europe in the World War area. During its first 25, by its count, the SVM inspired some 20,000 of the best, and I mean the very best, American students from the best colleges, Harvard and Princeton and Yale. It inspired them to go overseas in foreign mission service. Its mission inspired a countless number of other men and women, including a woman at Mount Holyoke College who was Catholic and went on to found the Maryknolls. One author has suggested that the commitment of the Mount Hermon 100 changed the course of the history of Christianity. Missionaries who responded to the SVM appeals undoubtedly laid the foundation for the Christian church's spread around the world. The result is that today, while Christians remain about 32% of the world's population, which is the same as it was in 1910, the Christian presence in the global south has increased from 17.8% in 1910 to 60.8% in 2010. Beginning in 1891, quadrennial conferences were held by the Student Volunteer Movement. The purpose of the movement and its conferences was to recruit students for lifelong service in missions. After a student signed the declaration card, the SVM referred them to the various mission boards who made the actual arrangements for them to go overseas. Very early, the watchword of the movement became the evangelization of the world in this generation. Very famous statement. Seventh-day Adventist participation in the SVM was inspired in part by reports in the Review and Herald from the Missionary Review of the World, a periodical founded in 1878 by Royal G. Wilder, former missionary in India. A report in the Missionary Review of the Mount Hermon meeting by John R. Mott prompted the first articles on the Student Volunteer Movement in the Review and Herald in 1889. Endorsing the methods of the SVM, the author of the review article focused on the needs of the foreign fields. Quoting the watchword of the SVM, the article used statistics to show how the evangelization of the world in this generation could be accomplished. The author of the review article argued that if supply and demand could govern management of secular affairs, then why should it not the same wisdom and foresight be manifested to meet the needs of the work of God? Evidently, SDA missions were to receive not only inspiration from the SVM, but strategy from the business empires of the day. By the fall of 1890, a foreign mission band had formed at Battle Creek College, apparently independent of the SVM. Within a short period, it affiliated with the SVM and began correspondence with the central office. On February 17, 1891, the Review and Herald published a notice of the First International Convention of the Student Volunteer Movement. That notice stated that all who are interested in the movement should attend this convention. We know of no enterprise in the advancement of foreign mission work that we can endorse more heartily than the student volunteer movement. That's the Review and Herald. Within 2 weeks of the publication of this notice, a delegation of 3 men and 3 women from Adventist institutions in Battle Creek arrived in Cleveland, Ohio to attend the first SVM convention. The Battle Creek delegation included P.T. McGann and Fred Rossiter from the college, plus 4 delegates from the sanitarium. In addition, Georgia Burris arrived as the sole delegate from the entire state of California, the delegate from the Pacific Bible School of Oakland, California, an institution of about 28 students, sponsored by the California Conference that provided training for Bible workers and females. Within 4 years, Miss Burris had spent some time studying at Healdsburg College, became a delegate to the second SVM convention for Healdsburg, and then arrived in India as the first official SDA missionary in India. In an article in the Review published 2 weeks after the convention, McGann wrote how he was impressed with the seriousness of the movement. He wrote, "There is a movement, a scattering out of heathen lands, not a theory that the world ought to be evangelized, but a movement that is destined to accomplish that event." He highlighted the address by A.J. Gordon on the subject of the Holy Spirit in missions. In the address, Gordon argued that just as the Holy Spirit was given to Jesus at his baptism to enable him in his mission, so the Holy Spirit had been given to his followers to be missionaries as he was. The closing session of the convention was particularly impressive, according to McGann. He described how the meeting lasted 3 hours and every moment of the time being well occupied. He reported, God by his Spirit was manifestly present. The solemnity of this occasion was nearly equal to that of any other meeting the writer ever attended. A week later, Uriah Smith's son, Leon, wrote another lengthy article in the Review about the convention. The younger Smith was an associate editor of the Review and a delegate to the convention from the University of Michigan. Like McGann, he noted the impact of Gordon's address on the Holy Spirit. Smith restated the story of the beginning of the SVM at length, including with the statistic that 6,200 volunteers had signed the pledge. He noted that in each institution, the volunteers are organized in what is known as the volunteer band. They hold weekly meetings for prayer and the systematic study of missions. They also seek to extend the movement by securing new recruits. Smith mentions that once a person has signed the pledge, he is bound to go, unless directly hindered by providence, without waiting for any special call from heaven to go. For Smith, the student volunteer movement suggested a fulfillment of the prophetic utterance of Christ that this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations before the end shall come. Mentioning the motto, the evangelization of the world in this generation, Smith noted that it does not indicate an expectation of the conversion of the world, but a commitment to carry the gospel to the world. Quoting one of the convention speakers, Smith states, "The aim is not to bring the world to Christ, convert them, but to bring Christ to the world. The latter man can do. The former is the province of God and the Holy Spirit. Seventh-day Adventist reader might ask, well, how should SDAs view this movement? Smith addressed this issue head-on, saying, it is hardly necessary to add that the student volunteer movement is one which merits the full sympathy and cooperation of Seventh-day Adventists. According to Smith, it is part of the great gospel work which God is doing for the world in this last generation of its history, and in which it has pleased him to assign us, Seventh-day Adventists, so wonderful a part. Skipping to the next paragraph. Smith's ringing endorsement of this general Christian missionary movement suggests that Seventh-day Adventists of his day were open to the work of the Holy Spirit in the missionary work of other denominations and movements, and that SDAs could profitably participate in such a movement. Thus, it is not surprising that for the next 50 years, Adventist colleges sent delegates to virtually all the SVM conventions, and that their attendance had an impact on the church as a whole. Two notable examples of Adventist participation in the SVM come from the 1894 convention. H. Camden Lacey was a delegate from Battle Creek College to the convention held in Detroit. His sister, May Lacey, had just married Ellen White's widowed son, Willie. In remembering the convention, Lacey recalled conversing with Georgia Burris about the convention's emphasis on the Holy Spirit. Following a study on the personality of the Holy Spirit, Lacey presented a series of Bible studies on the subject at a convention in Courtmont in 1896. Ellen White's literary helper, Marion Davis, was present at the studies, and Lacey well remembered her very evident interest and the fact that she took copious notes. Lacey seemed confident that Marion Davis had conveyed the content of his presentations to Ellen White, and that she had modified her language about the Holy Spirit as a result. And see Gil Valentine's recent article on that in AUSS. Also attending 1894 convention was H. Newton Evans, later to be the president of the College of Medical Evangelists. Reminiscing in 1826, he reported that at the convention, he first caught a vision of a healing ministry, Though he never went overseas in mission service, Evans inspired many with the possibilities of medical ministry. How extensive was Seventh-day Adventist participation in the student volunteer movement? How much did the SVM influence Adventist missions? Well, one way that the SVM influenced SDA missions was how it raised the moral issue of equity and human need. The SVM urged the question, with the vast needs of heathen lands, how could a person remain in a land of plenty, advancing their own material comforts, when so much of humanity is in desperate need of the gospel, of education, and of medical care? Repeatedly, this issue was raised by the FBM and SVM and echoed in Adventist discussion of missions. The student volunteer movement also provided a pattern for SDA missionary preparation in the form of the foreign mission bands. According to Fred Rossiter, while on summer break from Battle Creek College in 1890, the idea of the foreign mission band came to him. He claimed his idea for the band was independent of any other inspiration, but during the first semester of this Battle Creek College foreign mission band, he began a correspondence with the student volunteer movement, and Fred Rossiter himself, the founder of the band, was chosen as a delegate to the first SVM convention in February of 1891. By that time, there was also a foreign mission band at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. Within just a couple of years, students formed similar bands at Union College and Healdsburg College. However, each story of the founding of these early bands includes references to the fact that there was significant opposition to them on the part of some faculty members. Apparently, some faculty opposed participation in a non-Adventist movement. The case of the Walla Walla College foreign mission band, organized in 1907, is particularly compelling. The story of its founding includes no mention of the student volunteer movement, but a quotation of the student volunteer movement declaration, pledge, taken verbatim from the front of the SVM declaration card, with no acknowledgement of the SVM connection. The article then goes on for a full paragraph describing what the declaration meant, using the description on the back of the Student Volunteer Movement card, virtually word for word, again without acknowledgement. Foreign mission bands formed on virtually all Adventist college campuses and many academy campuses as well. There are records for foreign mission bands organized at Stamborough Park College, Newbold College, Cologne in the early 1920s, and the Philippines in 1935. Many of the bands had 3 tiers of membership. Active members had signed the declaration, associate members attended meetings and participated in activities, while attending members did just that. Who participated in the student volunteer movement? Well, the list includes a who's who of well-known Adventists. Foreign mission band members included Harry Anderson, one of the first official missionaries to non-Christian peoples in South Africa. Others are W.R. Beach, Winton Bevan, Adlai Ested, who served as a missionary in China, William Landine, Howard M. Lee, and Harold Oberg of Korea, Horty Ford of Peru, Frank Oster of Persia, Bender Archbold, William Murdoch, and Denton Reebok. SVM convention attendees included Matilda Erickson Andros, Lathan Hawley, T.R.M. Howard, interesting character, Emmy Kern, and Percy McGann. Others who completed application blanks for the SVM include Harry W. Miller, his wife Maud, along with Dr. Selman. Both couples served as the first medical missionaries in China. And thanks to Ruth for that note. David Paulson's completed SVM application is marked sailed, but there is no record of Paulson's doing foreign mission work. One might wonder how much these foreign mission bands were related to or inspired by the SVM. Some may have had little, if any, relationship to the formal SVM movement. However, there is ample evidence that Adventist mission bands used SVM material and attended local and state SVM meetings in the 1920s, in addition to the national conventions. The actual meetings of the foreign mission bands were usually held once a week or twice a month. Often the band met before the Friday evening Vespers program or during the chapel time during the week. The general meetings of the band alternated with group meetings of band members who organized according to their geographical area of interest. Often the group members would present a program at the general meeting that highlighted aspects of the work in their area, whether it was China, Africa, South America, or some other field. There was often a strong emphasis on the need for workers in these fields. Missionaries who were home from their place of service were often tapped as leaders of the entire band or of the geographical groups. How extensive was the Adventist participation in the student volunteer movement? Well, Adventist participation was deep and lengthy, and as far as the depth was concerned, consider the work of M.E. Kern, the 1898 delegate from Union College to the SVM convention. Shortly after he graduated from Union that year, he began working with young people in Nebraska, the Central Union. Then he headed the first Young People's Missionary Volunteer Department for the General Conference starting in 1907. In 1902, the Young People's page of the Youth Instructor began to publish its aim, the Advent message to all the world in this generation. Kern was impressed by a talk given by Mott at the 1898 convention on the morning watch. Now, many of us have pledged ourselves to keep the morning watch, but we had no idea what we were pledging ourselves to. What Mott and Kern intended by the morning watch was a personal time of prayer every morning focused on the application of a Bible verse text to a person's life. The time spent doing this was to be a morning activity that took precedence over everything else. Kern's promotion of the morning watch made it a significant part of the devotional life of Adventists in the first half of the 20th century. Further evidence of the depth of the participation comes from a missions issue of the Signs of the Times, dated October 30, 1907. The lead article was by Arthur T. Pearson, one of the initiators of the student volunteer movement and one of its staunchest supporters. On page 10 of the same issue appeared an article entitled "To the World in This Generation" by none other than A.G. Daniels, who is described as being the president not of the SDA Church, but of the SDA Foreign Mission Board. He describes how thousands of ardent Christians believe that the gospel can, that it should, and that it will be carried by the church to all the world in this generation. The watchword is the ringing, thrilling, daring watchword of the student volunteer movement. May the fullest success crown this scriptural and therefore consistent and timely effort of this great movement. The length of official Adventist association with the SVM is quite surprising. The SVM took a significant turn toward the social gospel in 1920, and by 1928, one of its leaders, Sherwood Eddy, denounced the watchword in his public address to the convention. Adventist reports of that convention became more critical as years went by. However, the General Conference continued to send official representatives to the SVM conventions through 1956. As time went on, the foreign mission bands undoubtedly became less and less associated with the SVM. However, they continued to be important recruiting grounds for mission service. So far, I have charted 5,339 student years of membership in foreign mission bands and Adventist colleges. And there must be twice as many people who went through those bands than I've already charted. In 1933, L.L. Cavaness described a study which compared students who signed the pledge and attended foreign mission bands to a list of missionaries who were sent out on foreign service between 1913 and 1920. The conclusion? At first, in 1913, about a third of those going out to the mission fields were found on the list of students of previous years who had signed such a declaration during their school days. This proportion increased until 1920. It had reached 2/3. I'd like to find that study and compare it to the list of 687 foreign mission band members that I've compiled from published sources. There was a direct connection between the foreign mission bands and the beginnings of the student missionary program of our day. In 1959, the foreign mission band leader at Washington Missionary College, this institution, perhaps in this building, Ronald Leffler, was appointed to a new experimental program of missionary apprenticeship, spending a summer in the Inter-American Division. By 1962, 3 years later, those sent for summer missionary apprenticeships were described as student missionaries. In conclusion, it is apparent that Seventh-day Adventist mission effort did not occur in a vacuum. Instead, it occurred in the context of the broadly Protestant student volunteer movement. Adventist participation in that movement was early, it was deep, and it lasted until virtually the end of the SVM. My previous paper described some of those details, and I hope to publish someday this research. However, we can learn some lessons from this study. From about 1860 and perhaps earlier, the Review and Herald quoted and commented on general news items from both the global scene and the Christian world. The Review saw its mission as relating current events to the signs of the end. Thus, the editors welcomed the Missionary Review of the World and quoted from it extensively. Adventists in earlier years saw themselves as part of the great Protestant movement and had few qualms about joining that movement in its missionary activities. At the same time, Adventists affirmed a unique calling for the Adventist movement and felt that their involvement with the greater Protestant world enhanced their own mission. The Protestant message was about a crucified and risen Savior. Adventists affirmed this message. However, they were motivated to take it one step further. They said their message was about a crucified, risen, and soon coming Savior. Adventists of this era therefore affirmed the basic Christian doctrines and basic Christian activity of the Protestant churches. They did not denounce them as apostate Protestants. While at the same time, Adventists saw themselves as having a unique eschatological and prophetic message that built upon basic Protestant Christianity.
I would like to invite our presenters to come to the front. The four that just presented in the session. And we have about 20 minutes for asking questions and giving answers. David.
First, thank you to all four Very, very interesting papers. If I may, I think Edward and Michel did the situating perhaps the best. Who would have thought that you couldn't understand Adventist youth and student and missionary voluntarism without looking at that wider history? And I'm still fascinated by Michel's paper, these wider concepts of sacred time and space. So thank you very much. To Kevin, I sort of got both a commendation and a reproach, if I may. Commendation is that was extraordinary research, highly original and sort of upending one's concepts of Adventism and the Civil War. The reproach would be that I don't feel it particularly situated Adventist history. It was a very in-depth. I wonder if you may be able to extend it, the situating, the contextualizing a bit. What was the view, or have you not been able to have access to the sources to say, what were the view that outsiders had of this process? So what you're saying is Adventists themselves were highly conflicted. Many were highly enthusiastic about fighting and others were not. And you hint at one point that perhaps one reason draftees found things difficult was because some people were aware. When they said we're a peace church, well, that wasn't strictly speaking true. So, have you got any sense of you've shown magnificently what was actually happening with Adventists in the 1860s, but do you have a sense of what was of how that was perceived beyond the Adventists, whether by government, military officers, or indeed any other Protestant churches, perhaps, another peace church that was saying, well, these Adventists, we're a peace church, these Adventists say they are, but they're not really. I don't know whether you can comment on that at all.
Sure. Thank you. That's a very good criticism of the particular choice of this paper in this conference. I tried valiantly to look for this kind of information. The only sources that I have found have been already uncovered and mentioned by others, where you have in the review a couple of cases of Adventist non-combatants who were held at gunpoint for a while and these types of things. I have searched in newspapers and other things, and perhaps I could find more in like an archive and that kind of thing, but I haven't had the time to do so. I have not seen any kind of comments. I mean, you have a Jewish father, Bernard Behrend, who writes in shortly after Abraham Lincoln is extended, basically said that people in the military should have Sundays off to respect the Sabbath. He does that in 1862, and shortly after this, Jewish father writes in and says, "What about all of the Seventh-day Baptists and all of the Jews and all of the infidels or atheists and so forth? What about them? Can we have a different day, Saturday, or no day at all?" But of course, they don't mention Seventh Adventists in that letter. They're not aware, and so there are such small numbers that it seems as though Adventists really didn't hit the radar, and I have to theorize that that military commanders must have known at least some of these cases, because there was plenty of them to be there. One case which would be fascinating if military records could exist is there was one Adventist who was a captain, and as a captain he had the authority to grant time off, etc., and these types of things. But as far as situating it better in a broader context, I have not yet been able to find any kind of documentation. In fact, most of the stories of these men remain a mystery. There's very little documentation to suggest what their story was like, other than that we know that they were there.
Just as a follow-up, there are records in the U.S. National Archives.
Yeah.
If this is something you were to pursue other than for a paper, that would be worth doing.
Absolutely.
But the other thing I would say is, if you are looking to situate it, you had one comment near the end which I thought was very interesting. Perhaps you could briefly reflect on that, which is what this shows is that movements that believe in the second Adventists, as they would be called in Britain, the assumption is normally that they have no interest in activism in the world because we're all waiting for the imminent apocalypse.
Right.
And really, this fits, I think, with wider evidence that abolition, that there are a whole group of premillennialist abolitionists in Britain as well as America and others. And I think there you've got, there's something that's very significant,
potentially that perhaps there, that this can go with that wider picture. The premillennialists, despite what was said at the time as well by historians, aren't necessarily people who are uninterested in what's going on in their society.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that is how I situated this paper, and specifically in reference to how I quoted Matthew Sutton in his work. And I've seen this in other ways as well, not just Civil War, but in my research on Adventist inventors, and just other things that I've done. There are so, if you want to look at the local context, which is often missed, we got a nice treat from Dr. Stray here, but when you look at the local context, there is often Adventists who are prominent leaders within their local civic realm. And they are prominent citizens, at least locally. And so there are many ways to challenge this concept. And so I did try to situate my paper to a broader context in that way. But I could do more. Yeah.
It's a question for Kevin.
Oh, so sorry.
The two gentlemen that got disfellowshipped,
Yes.
and then publicly stated on the review, the cynic in me wonders if perhaps they were disfellowshipped deliberately for that purpose.
This is a great question. One of them, Enoch Hayes, is he enlists in January, like the end of January 1865. This is the same time that's hitting the review and Adventist consciousness that Seventh-day Adventists are not able to get non-combatant status in the war, and he's disfellowshipped like a week or 10 days later. But the first case, it's Hiram M. Bates. He actually enlists in October 1864, October 7, 1864, and he is not disfellowshipped until just at the exact time that Adventists become aware that non-combatants are not being recognized in the field. So he's disfellowshipped at the same time as Enoch Hayes in the end of January, early February. What's interesting about this is that Hiram's brother, William, enlisted on the exact same day, was a Seventh-day Adventist in the exact same church, yet his name is not listed as being disfellowshipped. And the question is, of course, why not? And I've gone through other record books and shown that other Adventists were not disfellowshipped. One guy was disfellowshipped, and then he was actually reinstated while he was still fighting as a soldier. He was put back on the official books. And this is in one congregation, so even local congregations did not act in an even manner in this point. Another question over there?
It's for you, Captain. I think maybe previous scholars on this subject have relied too much on the review. Can you say something about your sources?
Sure.
That seems so fascinating.
I would go a step further than that, and really, as you look at it, most of my sources are the review. And I would say that most historians on the subject previously have looked at only theological treatises in the review. They have not read the letters from Adventist members, and they've not read obituaries. I started this research and I said there had to be some soldiers, and I was looking from like 1880 to like 1950. I was searching for words like Civil War or veteran or things like this because I figured that that's about the time they started to die. I started finding so many. I was like, well, I wonder if there was any in the 1860s themselves. I'm like, nah, couldn't be. They would have been caught. But that's where I found the overwhelming majority of these people. And so this really gets to a larger questions about what is Seventh-day Adventism. And we often talk about this, and we do our work without thinking about that question. And we write about leaders and intellectual people, and we write about ideas, but we don't talk about, and we have not done good at talking about Adventist people. And I find that a little bit curious because really, Adventists, we claim that we define the church as the body, as people, yet we talk about it as leaders and leaders only, which is really not what Adventists claim theologically. And so I think that if we think about Adventism in a broader context as people, then we're going to learn a lot more about our movement and our history.
For Kevin again.
I apologize.
I'm trying to bring it up to date here today. Are we still a peace church? I don't find this in our 28 fundamental beliefs. Do we still?
It is not a fundamental belief. I myself am a pacifist. I don't believe that it's the right thing to take human life. I don't encourage it, and I would never recommend it. And I think that we need to do a good job of teaching Adventists what it can do to you, not only physically, but morally and ethically and spiritually, out the effects of war on a person. But what I do not cover in this paper is what happens afterwards. And of course, Adventists, they begin to look at these documents as if they were an accurate description of the Adventist position during the Civil War, and they begin to claim that as what Adventists should do normatively. Interestingly, though, when Ellen White is asked during the Spanish-American War, she never tells Adventists, well, we decided this in the Civil War, look at our policy. Adventists didn't think in this way in the 19th century. They didn't have any standard policies that people were expected to follow or any fundamental beliefs or things like this. And so when it comes to Adventism, it really changes in the 20th century quite a bit. And there have been times, of course, we could talk about other conflicts and other wars where that has caused division and split. And of course, in Germany and World War I, it causes another schism. And so it's an issue that has always been delicate, and people have taken different sides, and we've always been very diverse on it. And so officially, I mean, yeah, we recommend that no one volunteers, but it's not a doctrine.
You don't ever see it being part of our fundamental beliefs?
No, it's not. It's not.
Another question for Kevin. Sorry.
Oh my goodness, I apologize to my colleagues.
Two things.
Yes.
There's a wider context for Sabbath-keeping and Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed in the Sabbath record, Seventh-day Baptist,
Yes.
that they have a much higher profile for their support of the wars.
Mm-hmm.
The ending of slavery was a big issue for them, and they highlighted their members that participated in the war. So that provides some wider context. The other issue on context is your study gives a whole new meaning, a whole extra meaning to why James White had his stroke.
Yes. Oh, Ellen White says it specifically.
This is not just long-term work stress.
No.
This was the stress of maybe fudging the truth and the difficulties of the marrying party and the pacifism. All of this happened just before his stroke.
Yeah, it does. There are many ways that we could broaden this out. I found it difficult because in 25 minutes I had to I couldn't just take it in any direction because people needed to understand that how I think it worked out. But yeah, when you look at Adventism, you know, if you look at the use instructor and the review, some of these stories are mentioned there. Like in the use instructor in 1863, an Adventist who had volunteered was stationed in Minnesota and was fighting Native Americans. And he actually writes a story in the use instructor, which is published, and talking about God's deliverance, etc., from being attacked by savages, as he says. And so it's important to understand that, like, even compared to Seventh-day Baptists, Adventists did publish some of these stories in the review. It's just people haven't caught them. Historians have not caught them. But it was not probably to the same degree. And it's significant that these stories have not been fostered and preserved by the church. But it's important to also note there that it was not just combatant stories that were not preserved, but the pacifist stories, the non-combatant stories were also not preserved. It's not really until World War II that we start having a lot of stories about Adventists in the military being written down.
Do we have a couple questions also for the other presenters? Yeah.
For Michel, you know, you've seen this book, I think it's Stephen Miller, The Peculiar Life of Sunday, a history of Sunday, of views of Sunday in England and America. I find very fascinating. Hardly mentions Adventists. He doesn't know anything about a universal Sunday law. This idea of the sound of Sabbath is so fascinating to me because early Adventist Sabbath keepers were extremely noisy, shouting. You know, the doctor came. Ellen White goes into vision, and somebody calls the doctor. The doctor wouldn't come into the house because he heard the shouting in vision and wouldn't come in. And they're singing these white spirituals, and they're just noisy people. But now, as Sabbath becomes more important, and they suddenly realize that we ought to be a quiet people. And so then Ellen White's visions are tamed into nighttime dreams, and shouting disappears, and you know, it's the Lutenization of charisma, you know. But this is fascinating to talk about the sound of Sabbath here, there, and everywhere over Adventist history. I never dreamed of, thought of it before, but yes. And then the California thing, you see, you know, Donald Trump is trying to make America great again. He hasn't got into Sunday yet, but California will be a big problem for him, like it is in every other department.
Well, thank you for that comment. I actually hadn't thought of sound or noise in connection with Ellen White's visions, but I'll have to look into that. Certainly. Yeah, seems there's many people I can consult here on that topic. One thing that I have been thinking about, though, that I would like to expand this paper into is Adventist domestic missions, just in the Bay Area alone. For example, the Berkeley Seventh-day Adventist Church is going out into Chinatown and handing out pamphlets in the 1890s. Was it acceptable to be in such a noisy space on Sabbath? Was it okay to go into a place where a different language was spoken, where perhaps things that were unintelligible but could have desecrated the Sabbath if they were translated were being said? So this idea of movement across space as well is very interesting to me. But thank you again for the comment.
Do you have any ideas for whether it was the noise of the press that led to Willie White's arrest, or just the fact that it was working?
I think the fact, from what I have read, and I think there's very little documentation about that arrest itself. I can't seem to find any official legislative records for his prosecution even.
I thought it was just a neighbor that didn't like him and he was doing yard work or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but that's...
I thought he was operating the press on.
I believe it's because he was operating the press on the assembly.
Because I was taught the yard work story in Pathfinder.
Maybe that's where...
Oh, really? We'll have to look into that.
I think we have time for one more question. So who wants to be the last one? Nick?
I'll ask also a different fellow. Ed, your paper I found very interesting. And it reminds me, I wasn't familiar with that particular side of the story, but I was more familiar with the fact that we had representatives at the Edinburgh Missionary Conference in the 1910. And so there was this willingness to kind of participate in a larger Protestant missionary effort, and we viewed as co-workers, but we never, and George Knight points this out, participated in the segmenting of the mission field, where certain portions were given to certain churches, and that's part of the reason we're the most widespread Protestant denomination in the world. Right? In part, it's our selfishness, perhaps. But how do you square that with? You mentioned in your paper that they didn't talk about them being Babylon or fallen Babylon, and yet in other contexts, certainly their evangelism, they are saying those things. So how do you square it? How do you reconcile that, or do you, or?
Well, I would guess that the way they would approach that was that what the student volunteer movement and those Christians were doing in spreading the gospel was fulfillment of Bible prophecy, and they certainly would support that. Opposition to or the advocacy of Sunday legislation would be in evidence in a time when they would talk about apostate Protestantism. So it would depend on the time and place. The involvement of officials, it's also evident that there were, in addition to Spicer, 3 other Adventist official delegates to the Edinburgh Conference. One of them was Guy Dale, a member of the first Four Mission Band at Union College, who was the de facto president of the European Division. Another one was the South Scotland president, and the third one was H. Camden Lacey, who at that time was the principal of Stanborough Park College.
So it may be that the evangelists had a more fundamentalist outlook, but the missionaries were a bit more willing to engage and...
In fact, those who were involved in the student volunteer movement look almost like a who's who of those in Adventism who pushed the boundaries. C.L. Benson, the man here at Washington Missionary College, who was also a history teacher, who then was pushed out as well. And of course, the student volunteer movement and the Edinburgh Conference morph into the ecumenical movement and the World Council of Churches. And the whole movement towards the social gospel in the 1920s and thereafter certainly takes a strong turn that way, which again is surprising that the official representatives keep being voted to be sent to these meetings.
Thank you.
A big thank you to our speakers. afternoon session comes to a close at this point, and I think we still have a couple announcements.
Just to announce that the bus is there to take you back to the GC or to your hotel. And you have some bottles of water, you want to take the rest of the nuts and go. Thank you so much for coming. It's a great session so far. We hope you enjoyed it, and we know the weather will change, so have no fear. So, but the bus is there, and thank you so much, and thank you for being on Washington Adventist University campus.
And thank you, guys.